What's up, guys? I have the new iPad mini to my left and I have the Nexus 7 to my right, and I wanted to take the time to really play with the iPad mini this whole entire weekend before actually doing this comparison. Being that I've already have the Nexus 7 and I've used it for quite some time now, I just felt it was fair that I give the iPad mini a couple of days to play with. However, I am a heavy iPad user. You guys should know this, especially if you follow me. You notice that I always use my iPad for just about everything. If you haven't seen my review, the TF300 versus the iPad 3, you'll notice that I always usually give the edge to the iPad. So with that being said, I do like the iPad. However, things are a little different when comparing both devices. They are completely different. Apple decided to compare them, so I figured why not. The first thing we're going to talk about is the form factor and how both devices feel. The Nexus 7 feels really good in the hands, and one thing that you can easily do is actually pick it up with one hand. You really can't do that with the iPad mini unless you have really large hands. Notice that I'm not grasping the Nexus 7 this way. I can easily just use my hands and pull it up to pick it up. Not so with the iPad mini. It is virtually impossible unless you have really long nails. Maybe you could do it. Otherwise, you would have to open your hands completely in order to pick it up. And in doing so, if let's say you're sipping coffee with this hand, you would have to do something like this in order to get it properly aligned so that you can view it. With the Nexus 7, like I said, you can just easily pick it up with one hand all day long, no problem, and just continue sipping your coffee. The other thing is how the devices feel in your hands. The Nexus 7 has a really great weight distribution. It is heavier than the iPad mini, but that's a personal opinion. I'm not going to say which one's better. All I'm going to say is that this one, to me, feels really good in the hands, despite it being a little heavier. It's not uncomfortable to hold. I did my review on the Nexus 7 a few months ago. You can watch that. I've left that link down below. And one of the things I've said is how great this device feels. The iPad mini, it's not that it's bad, but it's not good. When I hold this device, I still feel that I need to hold it with two hands. When I try to hold it with one hand, I feel that it's going to slip off my hands just because of these edges here. They're really slippery. I don't know what Apple did here. It would have been nicer to have a bigger grip. Also, you'll notice that it has an edge-to-edge display. When I visit websites and I try to hold this with one hand, a lot of times I'm pushing on pictures or I'm pushing on links and it tends to take me to somewhere else because I'm holding it this way. Okay, so that was a huge downfall. With the Nexus 7, you do notice that it's not an edge-to-edge display, and it has enough barrier so that when you hold it, you're not going to be accidentally pushing on links. So that was something that really was uncomfortable to do with the iPad and required me to do something like this, so that way when I'm browsing, I'm not accidentally pushing on things. The other thing, being a heavy iPad user, I was really disappointed with the display. The iPad mini has a 1024 by 768 resolution. Being that I use the iPad Retina display, it was completely backwards. It's like we're going back. The pixels, or you could really tell the pixels on this display compared to the Nexus 7. The Nexus 7 has a 1280 by 800 resolution, and it has a 216 ppi, which is more like a Retina display compared to the iPad Retina display model. This one has a 162 ppi, and again, you could really see the pixels, and being that I use the iPad heavily, I could tell how bad the pixels were, and that was a huge downfall. Other than that, going back to the hardware, the Nexus 7 has sort of like a plasticky material, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's very, very durable. I've thrown this in my backpack. I've, basically thrown it across the room, and no dents, nothing. It's one of the things when you're talking about a portable device, you want to make sure that it will last. This is a beautiful material, don't get me wrong. The iPad mini, it looks great, it's fantastic. If I had it sitting there in my office just looking pretty, it would be nice. However, I'm afraid to throw this inside my backpack because I can already tell that it's kind of scratching a little bit, and I've been very, very careful with this, so I'm afraid 6 months down the line, I don't know how this would look. The other things that you'll notice that are different from both is that this does not have a rear camera. Now, I know some people are going to say, well, you know, cameras on tablets are pointless, but you'll be surprised. Sometimes it can be useful. So kudos to the Apple team for putting a camera on the back of the iPad mini. For what it's worth, it's nice to have one. The other thing I wanted to talk about is the price difference, and I think that's one of the biggest things, is that the iPad mini, the 16 gigabyte model, is $329, and being that I have an iPad Retina display, I can almost tell you that it's just better to go with the big brother, because this is not really that small. When you put them side by side, or you put them on top of each other, there is a significant difference. And one of the biggest things that I've noticed is that this guy I can put in my pocket, I can put in my backpack in certain places, and this guy would require a lot bigger space. And not to mention, you can pick this guy up, going back to the price, 16 gigabyte model for $199. So it's a huge price difference when you compare both models. Now, in terms of operating system, Apple's iPad mini is running iOS 6, and the Nexus 7 is running Jelly Bean, which are two completely different operating systems. The iPad mini has access to a lot of different optimized applications that are made for tablet, while the Nexus 7 still is suffering from that type of development. That's not a bad thing. Most of the applications look okay, but Apple tries to make it seem that it is a negative experience. For what it's worth, the Nexus 7 is capable of doing a lot more things than the iPad mini. The customization on Android, as some of you guys have seen in other of my videos, is far beyond what iOS can do. However, depending on what your use is and what you decide to use, once again, I'm a heavy iPad user, and I've said this before that I'd rather just use the iPad with the exception of the Surface, but that's a whole different subject on its own. Depending on what you're going to use it for, I use it for heavy web browsing, so for me it works. I'd rather just use the iPad. But if you require that customization, then Android is for you. But that's a personal opinion, so we're not really going to dive too much in there. However, I will say this. Because of the form factor of these devices, the gaming on the Nexus 7 is probably going to be a better experience, mainly because you have access to ROMs or emulators like the Nintendo, Super Nintendo, Sega Genesis, and even PlayStation. So you can play these types of games or use these emulators to play mainly any type of video games on the Nexus 7. That is something that you really can't do with the iPad mini unless you jailbreak it. And you don't need to root your device in order to do that. It just works right out of the box. So that is a huge plus if you're a hardcore gamer and like to play those old school games, which I do, and that's one of the reasons that I really enjoy the Nexus 7. Those of you that need to jailbreak your Apple device, sometimes jailbreaking can take some time. As of right now, making this video, there is no jailbreak for the iPad mini. Could take several months, might even take a year. So that it could be a huge downfall. But however, you do have access to a lot of games in the or paid games in the App Store. So you're gonna have to take your pick: free, paid. Huge game library over here with the Nexus 7, Nintendo, Super Nintendo, versus just what most games that you can find here, like Angry Birds, Cut the Rope. All of those games are available also here on the Nexus 7, so it's going to be a hard toss-up depending on what you use it. Web browsing on both devices is very fast, and both devices are capable. I do notice that the experience on the iPad mini is a little bit smoother, but not by much. It's not something that you might be able to notice it. In certain websites, there's a small difference where it does render a little quicker on the iPad mini compared to the Nexus 7, but it's a very marginal thing that you won't be able to tell. The biggest, again, the difference is the display. That's something that you will notice, that the display on the Nexus 7 is a lot better, not to mention it is high definition. The display on the iPad mini is not HD, which I forgot to mention in the beginning when we were talking about resolution. So that could be a huge deal breaker if you're watching a movie, or you're going to see those bars in between on the iPad mini, where on the Nexus 7 you'll get the experience because it's full HD, or not full HD, but it's 720p, which is still considered a high def. So which device do I recommend? I would have to say the Nexus 7. The Nexus 7's form factor is really where it's at. The iPad mini, if you haven't seen my review, I'll left that link down below, or you can just click up here. You'll notice that the screen real estate compared to the Brother is not much different. And the fact that with the Big Brother you are able to buy a Retina display model is a huge difference. And not to mention the price point. This is just too expensive to buy compared to the technology involved in this. I think Apple's trying too hard with this, and I believe that Steve Jobs was right. There was the size of this is just not right. It's too wide. You really can't hold this with one hand. I mean, you can, but it's not comfortable, and the experience is not how it is on the Nexus 7. So I would definitely have to say the Nexus 7 is probably a better buy. If you definitely want to have an iPad, I highly recommend just go with the iPad Retina display. It's a really great device. You'll be happy with it. But the iPad mini, unfortunately, I'm going to return this because it doesn't fit anywhere in what I use. And I never return products. Even if they're really bad, I just keep them because I love technology. So unfortunately for this, Apple, I'm sending this back to you because I just don't see it working. Anyhow, guys, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you like what you see, please subscribe to my channel. I've also left my Twitter and Google Plus down below if you want to follow me. And once again, thanks for watching, and I will see you in my next video.